Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the dusty, sun-drenched world of ancient Egypt, where the Nile flows like a lazy serpent, the ibis birds gossip among the reeds, and someone just stole your ox. But instead of drawing a sword or launching a high-speed camel chase, you're going to do something far more civilized and slightly more annoying. You're going to file a lawsuit. Imagine this: you're barefoot, your linen tunic is sticking to your back, and you're clutching a complaint written in black ink on fresh papyrus. The ink smells faintly metallic. The scroll feels crinkly and precarious, kind of like your temper. You've spent hours drafting this thing with your reed pen, trying to sound firm but not dramatic, righteous but not whiny. You're suing your cousin for encroaching on your barley field, again, and the line between your crops and his is no longer a straight canal, but somewhere near that flat rock where the goat naps. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your name, in case you've forgotten in the heat, is Neferenpit. Everyone calls you Rennie. You're a grain counter, or at least you were, until your neighbor Senhotep decided to shift a few field markers when no one was looking. It's small stuff, but it matters. And in Egypt, it's not about yelling louder, it's about writing smarter. You shuffle into the local records office in Thebes, heart thumping. It's about as glamorous as a large clay oven, dusty, square, and full of flies. Inside, scribes in simple kilts lounge on cushions with tall stacks of scrolls. The one assigned to your case doesn't even look up. He just holds out a palm for your complaint. You pass over your carefully inked papyrus. The scribe unrolls it and scans it with the bored expression of someone who's read 12,000 complaints about barley, missing sandals, and unauthorized goose borrowing. He nods once. That's it. Your lawsuit is now part of the state archive. You're told to come back in 2 days for your hearing. That gives Senhotep time to respond. Will he deny it? Will he countersue and say you took his goat 3 months ago? Probably. Filing a lawsuit in ancient Egypt isn't about hurling accusations. It's more like writing a formal poem. You start with an opening flourish, something like, Neferenpit, humble servant of Amunius, do hereby lay complaint against Senhotep, son of Kai, who has trespassed like a crocodile into my field. Colorful language is expected. So is a little flattery to the gods and the pharaoh. You're not just writing to the judge. You're writing for posterity and for Ma'at, the divine principle of order, truth, and cosmic correctness. And trust me, you don't want to get on Ma'at's bad side. You spent the previous evening hunched over a reed mat, composing your complaint under the watchful eye of your aunt, who insisted on inserting a line about Senhotep's general untrustworthiness since childhood. You edited it out. Barely. Now, walking home, you feel lighter. You've done the thing. You've entered the gears of bureaucracy, and while they grind slowly, they usually grind in your favor, especially when your scroll smells strongly of fresh ink and you remembered to include the date, your job title, and 3 generations of family names. Here's the thing. Ancient Egypt didn't have lawyers. Not officially. If you had a scribe friend, they could help you word things properly. But the courtroom was a stage you performed on yourself. Everyone knew the etiquette. Everyone followed the script. Or else. Historians still argue whether this approach made the courts more fair or more performative. Did people actually win based on facts, or based on who could write the most elegant metaphor about goat theft? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What we do know is that the system worked. Legal complaints, some over 3,000 years old, are still being pulled out of tombs and temple storerooms. their black and red ink just barely faded. One even details a case where a woman sued her brother for misusing the family tomb. Yes, the afterlife had real estate disputes too. As you settle onto your reed bed that night, you try not to think about Senhotep and his smug grin. You try not to imagine him pretending he has no idea where your field markers went. Instead, you count ceiling cobwebs and rehearse your lines for court. Because tomorrow, it's not just about justice. It's about presentation. You're up with the sun, the air still cool before the Nile's breath turns it into soup. You comb your hair with a carved wooden pick, dab a little lotus oil under your arms. You may be suing someone, but that's no excuse to be uncivilized and slip into your best linen. Not too good though. You're not trying to look rich, just honest. You've heard the court is under the fig tree today, which sounds poetic until you realize it's literal. The local court, called the Kenbet, doesn't have a grand hall or marble steps. It has a tree, a large fig tree with wide leaves and dappled shade. Beneath it, the judges, usually 3 or 4 older men with varying degrees of wisdom and patience, sit on reed mats and drink beer from clay mugs that sweat in the heat. You find your place among the spectators, mostly neighbors, a few bored vendors, and someone's chicken, which does not stop clucking the entire time. The town's bailiff, a short man with an extremely long staff, calls your name with the booming importance of someone who gets to yell professionally. Neferenpit, son of Didia. You stand, clutching your scroll, your heart fluttering like a startled ibis. Senhotep's already here, of course, looking smug and somehow even cleaner than usual. His scroll is tucked under one arm, but you bet he didn't write it himself. You bet he had that slippery cousin of his, the one who's just a grain scribe, compose it. You mentally dock him 5 karma points. The judges nod. One waves a hand lazily. You step forward, clear your throat, and begin. You read your complaint aloud, trying not to mumble. You can hear your aunt's voice in your head, Project Rennie, like you're telling the gods themselves. As you speak, the judges tap their fingers or frown. One picks at his toes with a stick. But they're listening. Really listening. This isn't just about whether someone moved a marker stone. It's about whether order, is being kept. Whether balance is maintained. And balance in ancient Egypt is everything. Then Senhotep reads his version. Too slick. He accuses you of encroachment, complete with an eyewitness who saw you harvesting past the canal line. You suppress the urge to laugh. That witness is his cousin's son. He once tried to sell you fake honey made from boiled dates. Still, the judges nod again. One rubs his chin. Another scratches something onto a piece of pottery with a stylus. You hope it's not both men annoying. Here's the twist. The court may not decide today. In fact, they often take a few days, or even weeks, before reaching a verdict. They might send someone out to the fields. They might call other witnesses. Or they might just wait to see if one of you slips up and admits something dumb in public. That happens a lot. Historians still argue whether these courts operated more like community mediators or strict tribunals. The records suggest a bit of both. Some cases end with dramatic punishments. Others wrap up with, "The 2 parties shall now shake hands and never mention this again." Today, your judges seem to lean toward the more thinking required approach. They ask if you'll swear an oath. You nod. Of course. You lift your hand and speak the traditional formula, invoking the gods and your ancestors, swearing that your complaint is true and honest. It feels strangely powerful. Senhotep swears too. Loudly. You can almost hear the chicken cluck in approval. The fig tree creaks above you, the heat now fully settled into the day like a heavy cloak. Someone's kid starts crying. A clay cup tips over in the dust. And yet, here under this tree, something ancient and deliberate is unfolding. You're not just telling a story. You're weaving yourself into the fabric of law, the tapestry of Egypt's vast bureaucracy. It's not fast. It's not flashy. But it is real. As court wraps up for the day, you're told to come back next week. In the meantime, you're not allowed to move any field markers. Not that you were planning to. But you nod solemnly. Walking home, you pass the temple of Montu. There's a scribe outside copying something onto a scroll, his ink-stained fingers flying. You wonder if he's working on a royal decree, or just recording another complaint about missing sandals. Your feet ache. Your scroll feels heavier. But you've done it. You've spoken under the fig tree. You've entered the ring. And next week, the judges will decide whose ox is truly in whose field. The Nile floods when it pleases, but paperwork? That's forever. You're back under the fig tree for day 2, and while your feet still ache from the long walk over irrigation ridges, today's burden is heavier in your hands. A new scroll, sealed with a thumbprint of ochre. This one isn't a complaint. It's a document of land boundaries, inherited from your grandfather. Or at least, that's what your cousin says. You found it rolled up in the bottom of a reed basket behind the house altar, tucked under some cobwebs and a half-eaten mandrake root. Not exactly a vault, but it'll do. Documentation is your best chance now. You're realizing more than ever that suing someone in ancient Egypt without a lawyer isn't just about clever words. It's about evidence. You don't need drama. You need dirt-stained scrolls and shaky handwriting and enough family names to make your head spin. One judge squints at the scroll and mutters something about Henanu, son of Henanu, and you realize, yes, of course. Everyone was named Henanu back then. It's like trying to distinguish Jeffs at a modern office party. He asks if the scribe who wrote it is still alive. You squint. Unlikely, you say. He was old when my mother was small. The judge nods sagely, as if that tracks with the papyrus's flakiness. You're lucky, honestly. Many Egyptians weren't literate, especially in rural areas. They had to rely on scribes to record complaints, petitions, even wills. Scribes were like walking hard drives. Expensive, essential, and sometimes a little smug. The government was obsessed with writing things down. Births, deaths, pig counts, bread rations, how much beer your neighbor owed you for borrowing your hoe and mysteriously losing it in a canal. Still, not all scrolls were created equal. Some were charcoal on scraps. Others were drafted with precise red and black ink, sectioned neatly like sacred texts. Yours? Somewhere in the middle, legible, but written on the back of a reused tax form. At one corner, there's a faded doodle of a baboon. The judge hums. Another rubs his bald head, eyes scanning the names. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian really understood all these records, or whether the bureaucracy just looked impressive to scare people. Some scholars think the courts were mostly verbal, others point to enormous document archives and argue that literacy, if not widespread, was at least trusted. What's fascinating is that you, an average field dweller with slightly more ambition than sense, are allowed to argue a land case without a lawyer. There were court officials, yes, but no professional class of advocates. You represent yourself. Everyone does. And if you're lucky, you've got a family scribe or a neighbor with good penmanship and poor impulse control. You take your place, scroll in hand, and read it out loud, stumbling only once on the name Tidi. It's just hard to say with dignity. The judge doesn't laugh, but his nostrils flare. Senhotep brings his own scroll today. Not to be outdone, of course. His is newer, shinier, and written in someone else's handwriting. You recognize the script. It's from the temple school. Typical. He must have paid a priest scribe a jar of beer to make it look official. But that's the game, isn't it? Not just who tells the truth, but who writes it better. It's the ancient Egyptian version of a court tie. One of the judges calls for a field record, a kind of cadastral report made by a regional inspector. You didn't even know there was an inspector. A third cousin whispers that he lives near the canal bend, always smells like onions, and is known for accepting bribes in the form of goose eggs. Good to know. So here's what happens. They pause your case. Now they want to cross-check your grandfather's land plot with an official registry in the nearby district. That means sending a messenger on foot, which could take days. Maybe weeks if the inspector's in a bad mood. It's the slowest lawsuit in history, and it's also absolutely normal. Ancient Egyptian justice moved like a dung beetle pushing uphill. You wonder if you should bring a bribe, just something small, like a painted pot or a loaf shaped like Hathor. But you don't. You were raised better than that. Also, you only have one decent loaf left. In the meantime, while you wait for the court to resume, you've been advised to gather testimony. That's right. You're supposed to track down old neighbors, cousins, and anyone else who might have seen the disputed land back when it actually was your grandfather's. So the next few days, you're trudging through dust and gossip, knocking on mud brick doors. You find your great-uncle's widow, who insists she remembers the boundary because she tripped over it during the barley harvest of the year of the big fish. You write it down. Kind of. You also meet a former worker of your grandfather, who describes the field as the one with the lumpy corner and the cursed stone. That's helpful, in its own way. All of this will be brought back under the fig tree, delivered aloud, and then weighed with frowns and skeptical nose-hair tugs by men whose judgment could alter your entire season of planting. It's a bureaucratic slow dance. The scrolls, the statements, the whispers, the witnesses. Ancient Egypt didn't need lawyers. They had papyrus, memory, and social pressure. And you're learning fast. By the end of the day, you're exhausted. But your case is building, word by word, goose egg by goose egg. You wake with straw in your hair and papyrus ink still staining your fingers. The neighbor's rooster, whose internal clock has been broken since the reign of Hatshepsut, screeches its usual pre-dawn nonsense. You stretch, groaning, and rub your temples. Today's mission, testimony. See, when court cases stall in ancient Egypt, and they always stall, it's common practice to flood the courtroom with eyewitnesses. Not expert witnesses. Not even reliable ones. Just people. People who might have been there, or might have heard a cousin say something once during a drunken reedboat race. And it's up to the judges to decide whether that counts. You tuck your tunic, grab your reed pen, and begin what can only be described as legal herding. Your first stop is a neighbor who lives 3 houses down and has a reputation for owning the sharpest ears in the village. You find him chewing date bread with a vacant look and ask if he remembers your grandfather's field boundary. He squints at you, then at the horizon. "Oh yeah," he finally says. "It was right past the sycamore that got struck by lightning." You nod. Write that down. It's a start. Even if the sycamore was struck 30 years ago and now serves as a home for a suspiciously territorial ibis. As you gather more testimony, you begin to notice a pattern. Everyone agrees that the land used to belong to your family, but no one can agree on when it stopped or why. One person swears it was traded for a donkey. Another insists your grandfather lost it in a drunken bet during the festival of Batet, which, in fairness, would explain the mysterious absence of donkeys and the general air of shame surrounding the tale. You begin to understand something very profound. Ancient Egyptian law was not just about truth. It was about memory. And memory here isn't a crisp record. It's a tapestry of gossip, ritual, and selective storytelling. You return to the fig tree, which you now refer to mentally as courtroom fig, with 3 testimonies written on scraps of flattened reeds, one on the back of a fish tax slip. The judges accept them without flinching. One even nods in approval. This time, your opponent, Senhotep, may Horus mildly inconvenience him, arrives empty-handed. He claims no witnesses were available. The smirk he adds afterward makes you want to launch a small pebble at his sandal. But you don't. You're a citizen. You're civilized. The court listens. The scroll is reread. Your witnesses are quoted in their shaky glory. A debate breaks out over the phrase, boundary marked by dung heap, because one judge argues that dung heaps are not reliable landmarks. Another counters that they can be if the dung in question belonged to a sacred cow. That spirals into a 15-minute digression about divine bovine waste, which, somehow, becomes the philosophical heart of your land dispute. Historians still argue whether these courts were truly impartial or merely extensions of the local elite's will. Some say the judges leaned heavily on temple influence. Others claim they were surprisingly independent. In your case, you're starting to suspect that justice depends heavily on who brings the better snacks. You've got figs. Senhotep has honey cakes. Advantage him. To gain an edge, you decide to summon a final witness, an elderly priest who once blessed your grandfather's harvests. The man barely remembers your name, calls you that skinny one, and walks like his knees are made of old rope. But once seated under the fig tree, he closes his eyes and begins to speak in slow, sand-worn tones. He describes the field, the flood years, the way your grandfather planted emmer wheat in diagonal rows, a style no one uses anymore. He recalls the day Senhotep's father tried to buy the field and was turned away with a half loaf and a withering look. You watch the judges lean in. He finishes with a prayer to Thoth, god of wisdom and scribes. You'd like to think it was meant to bless your case, but it might just have been a general sign-off. Either way, the man leaves, trailing a scent of myrrh and dried onions. Now the judges begin deliberating. It isn't a formal process. There's no jury box, no powdered wigs. Just murmurs, glances, and occasionally a squabble over how much weight to give a fish tax receipt as legal evidence. You wait, and wait. Finally, one judge clears his throat. We'll review all testimony. Return after the new moon. You blink. That's nearly 2 weeks from now. Senhotep raises an eyebrow like he's already planning his victory song. You nod, bow respectfully, and head home. Along the way, you feel something unusual, not frustration, but momentum. You've made your case. You've gathered records, stories, memories like drifting petals caught in your hands. The trial is now a living thing, bigger than you, but shaped by you. And as you walk, the Nile glints beside the path. Somewhere upriver, a crocodile yawns. You think of your grandfather, and then you think of that priest's blessing, and the sycamore, and the dung heap debate. It's a mess, but it's your mess, and you're seeing it through. 2 weeks crawl by like a sunburned tortoise. You try to distract yourself with work, fixing that stubborn reed fence, sweeping sand off the floor for the 5th time that day, bribing the neighbor's cat to stay off your roof. But every night, you lie awake picturing those judges under the fig tree, debating the sacred legality of cow dung. Then, just as the moon begins its thin return to the sky, a temple runner appears at your door. He's sweaty, out of breath, and chewing on something that may or may not be lotus root. Court reconvenes tomorrow, he mumbles before jogging off towards someone else's porch. You spend the rest of the day prepping like a scribe facing a divine audit. Next morning, you show up at the fig tree early, scrolls tucked under your arm, a jar of barley beer in hand, just in case the judges need encouragement. But as you approach, something feels different. A new man stands beside the bench. Tall, lean, robes so white they practically sparkle in the sunlight. You squint. Is that a royal seal on his shoulder? Great. The court has a visiting inspector. Turns out, this is a scribe of the Per-Ankh, the House of Life, sent from a regional temple to observe rural judiciary efficiency. Translation: your sleepy, donkey-paced trial is now a bureaucratic showcase. Suddenly everything must be perfect. Documents checked. Records verified. Speech slowed to ceremonial rhythm. Even the fig tree seems to stand a little straighter. The inspector's presence introduces a strange kind of tension. The local judges, who usually nap through half your testimony, now lean forward like students during a pop quiz. The proceedings begin, and your case is read again, this time with extra pronunciation flourishes. Your fish tax receipt gets passed around like it's a royal decree. You take a deep breath and launch into your testimony recap. You read every line with measured calm, even pausing for emphasis like you saw that one temple priest do. You even throw in a few key phrases in formal Middle Egyptian, which makes the inspector raise one eyebrow and scribble something on his tablet. Senhotep follows with his rebuttal. To your annoyance, he's also upped his game. He's ditched the honey cakes and brought 2 new witnesses, both of whom swear the field belonged to his grandfather since the time of the long flood, which is both vague and highly suspicious. One describes the boundary as marked by a broken plow, which nobody else has ever mentioned. You file that away. The judges listen, scribble, nod. The inspector scratches his chin. Then comes the unexpected twist. The inspector himself asks to question both you and Senhotep, an unusual move in a local trial. He wants clarification on dates, exact flood patterns in the region. You try to answer each one clearly, but your memory of seasonal Nile levels 6 years ago is foggy at best. He frowns. Senhotep, on the other hand, confidently asserts that the Nile flooded to the third stone of the granary wall, which sounds very precise and therefore totally made up. Still, it earns a thoughtful murmur from the inspector. Historians still argue whether these inspectors actually improved legal fairness or simply enforced stricter temple control. Some evidence suggests that while they prevented blatant corruption, they also introduced bureaucratic complexity that left many villagers overwhelmed and confused. You for one feel both. After questioning, the inspector announces he wants a land survey. We will measure the disputed field, he says, and compare it with temple records. A murmur runs through the crowd, mostly bored goats and one man asleep in a cart. You set out with the group, judges, Senhotep, the inspector, and a scribe who keeps swatting flies with your court scroll. The field is exactly where it's always been, of course. Dry, flat, sun-warmed earth bordered by the ghosts of old harvests. But now it must be measured officially. Out comes the measuring cord, an ancient, sacred tool stretched tight between two posts and weighted with little lead plumb bobs. It's held by trained surveyors called harpadanapti, rope stretchers, whose job it is to walk the land and define space in cubits. You watch them measure, mutter, mark. Your grandfather's name is mentioned. So is Senhotep's uncle. A debate breaks out over a sycamore root. The inspector remains expressionless. After an hour in the blinding sun, they finish. The land is recorded, 12 cubits wide, 30 deep. Now, the inspector will compare this with temple land registries, kept under lock and seal back in the city. Which means another delay. As you trudge home, sweat trailing down your spine, a thought bubbles up. You're not just fighting Senhotep. You're navigating a vast, papyrus-choked bureaucracy where justice is weighed not only by truth, but by ritual, records, and reputation. That night, you find yourself dreaming of scrolls that slither like snakes, judges with ibis heads, and a fig tree that laughs when you try to speak. You wake up with your reed pen stuck in your hair and the cat finally off your roof. Progress is slow, but it's happening. And for now, that's enough. The next week passes like honey dripping down a wall. The inspector has taken your case scrolls back to the temple archive, where somewhere deep inside a stone chamber, priests in leopard skin robes sift through bundles of brittle papyri, grumbling over ink smudges and debating whether a faded bird symbol means cattle or garden hoe. You imagine your name whispered in a place that smells like frankincense, old linen, and damp clay. It's almost flattering. Almost. Meanwhile, life in the village marches on in its usual sun-bleached rhythm. The baker complains about sand in the flour. A cow wanders into the palm grove again. Your neighbor loses her goose and accuses the gods of mischief. You, though, live in a limbo woven from legal uncertainty and nervous anticipation. Then, with no ceremony, the inspector returns. He brings two things: an official land registry scroll and a companion, an archivist priest who looks like he hasn't slept in 3 reigns. They convene under the fig tree once more, and just like that, your case resumes. The priest steps forward and unfurls the scroll. It's large, detailed, annotated in red ink, and crammed with names, land measurements, and tax assessments. Your eyes go wide. You've never seen so much writing in one place. Somewhere near the bottom, after 4 entries about barley quotas and an ominous note about a broken well, there it is, your grandfather's field, described as situated east of the flood bank, adjacent to the grove of nut trees, 12 by 30 cubits. Bingo. Senhotep immediately protests. That record is outdated, he insists. The grove was moved years ago when the priestess planted her cucumbers. The inspector barely glances at him. The record is dated to year 5 of the last pharaoh's reign, he says, flatly, and corroborated by temple tithe receipts. That's temple speak for, we have taxes to match it. Senhotep sputters. I have living witnesses. The priest shrugs in the direction of the fig tree. Records do not forget, he says. Old men do. A small ripple of laughter passes through the onlookers. 3 elders and a donkey. The donkey might be snickering too. Still, you know it's not over. You've seen enough ceremonies to know, the closer you are to a verdict, the more dramatic the rituals become. And sure enough, The inspector requests a final rite, a formal oath-taking. Now this is serious business. In Egypt, taking an oath wasn't just swearing on your grandma's life. It involved invoking the gods directly, often in front of a statue, sometimes while holding sacred objects, and always with the belief that falsehood would bring divine punishment. And we're not talking bad luck, we're talking boils, blindness, or being eaten by a crocodile in your sleep. You are summoned to the temple courtyard that evening. The air is thick with incense. Oil lamps flicker along the sandstone walls. A priest approaches you with a solemn expression and presents a small statuette of Maat, the goddess of truth and balance. She's wearing her iconic ostrich feather headdress, expression serene, but judgmental in a very mom-caught-you-sneaking-dates way. You are asked to repeat the oath, that the field in question belonged to your grandfather, that the scrolls you presented were not forged, and that no bribery or deceit influenced your case. You say the words carefully, your heart pounding like a drum made of nervous papyrus. Then it's Senhotep's turn. He hesitates. His voice quivers. He swears, but he can't meet Maat's stone gaze. Historians still debate whether oath-taking ceremonies truly influenced legal outcomes, or whether they were just dramatic flourishes to lend finality. But many agree that, in a society where the divine permeated every detail of life, calling on the gods wasn't just symbolic, it was terrifying. You return home under the stars, unsure whether the judgment will be swift or delayed. Some trials in ancient Egypt wrapped up in a single day. Others dragged on for months. You've now crossed into week 5. The next morning, you are called once more. You sit under the fig tree, sandals dusty, scrolls tucked beside you. The inspector steps forward. The judges lean in. A flock of ibis birds flaps overhead, perhaps curious or perhaps judging everyone's grammar. The inspector raises the temple scroll. The field described in the plaintiff's documents, he says, voice slow and dry as the desert wind, matches the temple registry precisely. Witness testimony by the defendant's kin is contradictory and unsubstantiated. The oath was taken, and no divine sign of falsehood has manifested. The pause. In the eyes of the court, the field belongs to the plaintiff. Case closed. You blink. Did you hear that right? A quiet gasp from the crowd confirms it. The donkey brays in approval. Or indigestion. Either way, it's a win. You bow slightly, the way one should, and whisper a silent thanks to Maat. Then, just as you're about to gather your things, Senhotep mutters something under his breath about appealing to a higher court. You freeze. Appeals? In some cases, if you were really persistent and had the connections, you could appeal to a provincial governor or even a royal court. Of course, the odds weren't in your favor, especially if your opponent had stronger paperwork. But the threat hung there, like a sandstorm on the horizon. For now, though, you've won. You walk home slower than usual, savoring the way your feet press into the earth. It's yours again. Officially. Legally. Divinely. And hopefully, permanently. The sun is high and smug the next morning, as if it too has heard the verdict and wants to make sure you sweat just a little more. You wake with an ache in your back, a strange weight on your shoulders, and the distinct realization that winning the lawsuit didn't magically plant barley or repair your grandfather's old irrigation ditches. You won the paper, yes, but not the peace. Not yet. Because here's the thing. Ancient Egyptian justice was never just about guilt or innocence. It was about restoring Maat, the cosmic order. You've proven your claim, yes, but now comes the delicate work of coexisting with those who lost. And Senhotep is still right there, sulking 2 houses down, sharpening a hoe that looks suspiciously well-maintained. The land is yours. But if he poisons the well? Lets his goats accidentally graze your seedlings? Smashes your irrigation wall in the night? Well, the court doesn't have a night shift. This is why, in some regions, judges would end trials with ritualized reconciliations. A cup of beer shared. A blessing spoken aloud. Sometimes even forced marriages. Historians still argue whether these reconciliations were legally required or just temple custom. Unfortunately, your village didn't spring for the deluxe forgiveness package. You're on your own. So you do what any cautious farmer might. You make peace, carefully, strategically, performatively. You send Senhotep a basket of figs. Overripe. Symbolic. He doesn't respond. Then, you offer to help mend his roof. Not because you want to, but because gossip travels faster than boats on the Nile, and if you are seen being noble, any petty sabotage from his side will look all the worse. It works. Mostly. A few days later, his nephew passes you in the market and doesn't spit. Progress. With the feud cooling, you finally return to your field. Officially, legally, cosmically yours. The stalks are scraggly. The earth is cracked. But the light hits it in a way that makes you squint with pride. Or sunstroke. Hard to tell. You spend a week clearing weeds, bribing the irrigation boy to redirect a canal, and chasing off the village chickens, which seem to have developed an affection for your boundary markers. It's hard work, but this time, it's not anxious work. And yet, just as you're starting to relax, news arrives that knocks the date beer right out of your hand. The temple archivist is dead. Heart attack, probably. Or an angry goose. No one's quite sure. Why does this matter to you? Because his replacement, an overzealous junior scribe named the Mun, has announced a registry audit. That means he's reviewing old claims, updating borders, and purging inconsistencies. And guess whose file is still marked with a red wax tag for disputed resolution? Yours. You trudge back to the temple courtyard, heart pounding like a ceremonial drum. The Mun is there already, squinting at your scrolls, his ink-stained fingers fluttering like moths. Very interesting, he says without looking up. Did you know this papyrus is from a different scribe batch than the tithe records? You blink. So, he says with the enthusiasm of a man who's just found an excuse to feel important, they may have used different qubit standards. We'll need to remeasure your field. Qubit standards. You remember from years ago your uncle yelling about this. Depending on the region or time period, the standard Egyptian qubit could vary slightly by a finger's width or more. Most people used the royal qubit, about 52.3 centimeters. Others, especially local priests, used the so-called short qubit. And some weirdos, like the Mun apparently, like to argue about both. So you sigh, and fetch the land measure again. The man shows up with a rope stretched between two sticks, marked carefully every 7 palms. His apprentice trails behind, chewing on a reed and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. They pace out your field, again. This time, they measure diagonally, then crisscross. The apprentice marks everything down while the Mun watches, arms folded. You try to help by pointing out the old date palm that served as your grandfather's original boundary marker. The Mun dismisses it. Trees grow, he says. Too imprecise. The rope measurer nods. Also, sometimes goats knock them over. The measuring finishes. The report is handed over to the Mun, who frowns, makes several exaggerated sking sounds, and declares that while your field is mostly as described, the new measurement is short by 3 cubits on the east side. You open your mouth. You may keep the field, the Mun says breezily, but the temple will adjust your tax bracket accordingly. The barley yield is under reassessment. You stare at him, stunned. You won the case. And now you're paying more? Technically, yes. Because winning property didn't exempt you from state obligations. Quite the opposite. Landowners were taxed on estimated productivity, sometimes unfairly, and audits like this were how scribes kept busy between plagues. Still, you bite your tongue. You've dodged worse. And besides, you've learned something useful. In ancient Egypt, the law wasn't a finish line. It was a revolving door, manned by scribes with oily hair and limitless scrolls. So you thank the Mun, sincerely with a practiced bow, and back away slowly, like someone leaving a hungry lion alone with his lunch. Back home, you light an oil lamp and place your deed scroll in a clay jar, sealed with wax. You tuck it beneath a floor tile. And for good measure, you offer a tiny prayer to Thoth, god of scribes, to keep the ink from fading, just in case another audit crawls out of the papyrus pit. You wake to the sound of temple bells jingling across the rooftops, their distant tinkle reminding you that in Egypt, even the gods have a schedule. Today's task, subpoena divine witnesses. After all, If a disgruntled scribe can audit your qubits, imagine what Ammonius Ra and Osiris can do when you present your case directly to their statues. You gather your petition scrolls and head to the nearest temple, the small one dedicated to Thoth, god of wisdom and scribes. The air inside is thick with incense that clings to your hair, and oil lamps gutter in niches carved with hieroglyphs describing creation myths. You brush your fingertips over the smooth basalt statue of Thoth, whose ibis head stares ahead with eternal patience. Nearby, a stack of archived papyri waits under lock in a chest the size of a small ox. Mainstream historians confirm that many Egyptian temples housed vast legal archives, some filling rooms that once held grain stores, an ingenious repurpose of space when the Nile's bounty overflowed, e.g., the Temple of Karnak's document cache. You kneel and unroll your complaint, reading it aloud in a soft voice. You invoke Thoth's precise judgment and ask him to bear silent witness as you seek justice. Your reed pen trembles slightly, mostly from nerves, but maybe a little from dust-choked devotion. A temple boy shoves a basket of warding amulets into your hands. "For the gods to sign," he whispers. You nod, tucking them into your belt. As you step into the archive room, you see row upon row of scroll bundles tied with faded cords. The archivist, an elderly man with ink-stained robes, greets you without enthusiasm. You request copies of any precedent cases involving land disputes, heard by the Divine Council, a term that makes him sigh so loudly you fear he'll collapse into a pile of papyrus. He obliges, sliding 2 yellow documents your way, one describing a farmer who cursed a neighbor's well until it ran with red clay, another detailing a baker's daughter who claimed the goddess Batet intervened in a theft trial. Quirky fringe research suggests that some litigants actually inscribed curses on temple walls to sway divine opinion, like a cosmic Yelp review. Historians still argue whether such scribbles genuinely influenced legal outcomes or were merely dramatized piety for the benefit of onlookers. You gather the scrolls and shuffle to the statue of Mot, perched under a canopy of lotus garlands. Her ostrich feather balances precariously over her head, and legend says that if false testimony weighs heavier than truth on her scales, she'll pluck your tongue out. You clear your throat and read each line of your petition again, the boundary markers, the cubit measurements, the temple registry confirmation. With each word, you imagine Mot's stone eyes flickering. You place the scrolls in a ceremonial stand, offering a handful of barley grains as tribute. Outside, the temple courtyard is alive with pilgrims and traders. A vendor hawks authentic crocodile dung sunscreen, a callback to the cosmetic practices you mentioned under the fig tree, while a group of children chase a chicken wearing a broken sandal. You slip through a side gate into the shrine of Osiris, where a mid-sized statue of the god of the underworld stands draped in linen. This is more than symbolism. Many Egyptians believed that once you'd sworn an oath in front of Osiris, your case was doubly binding, since he'd personally remember every word come judgment in the afterlife. You whisper your petition again, slower, letting the echoes bounce off the columns. A tiny crack in the stone floor seems shaped like a hieroglyph for truth, which you take as a good sign. Then comes the oddest part. You must present your case in public temple ritual. A priest in leopard skin robes calls out your name, and you step into the temple aisle. Behind you, the wagging tongues of curious onlookers hush. You recite the essential facts: your name, your grandfather's land, Senhotep's meddling, the registry audit. It's performative, yes, but performative for the gods. The priest nods and sprinkles consecrated water over the scrolls while chanting a formula that blends legalese and hymns. You watch water droplets sparkle like diamonds in the torchlight, imagining each one erasing a falsehood. The ceremony ends with a trumpet-like blast from a bronze ram's horn trumpet, an ambient flourish that probably sounds more majestic if you're not standing next to the priest. You exit the temple courtyard, heart thudding, as a pair of ibis birds strut past, as if marching in formation. Later, you return to the fig tree court, stack of temple-certified scrolls in hand, feeling like you've just returned from a diplomatic mission to Olympus. The judges peer at the divine stamps, imprints of a prosastil leaf dipped in sacred ink, and murmur among themselves. Senhotep flails, calling this theatrics and pure temple politics. You simply shrug. If anyone can argue that gods don't know real estate law, it's him. Historians still argue whether invoking temples and statues truly added legal weight or if it was mostly a spectacle reinforcing the social hierarchy. Some say it slowed down cases. Others insist it legitimized the verdict in the eyes of the common folk. But for you, it provides another layer of security. If Senhotep dares dispute a divine witness, he risks cosmic retribution. That afternoon, a messenger from the court hands you a fresh decree drafted on bright white papyrus. Your case is to proceed directly to final verdict, bypassing further local delays. The judges cite the temple's divine confirmation as conclusive. You tuck the scroll into your tunic, smile inwardly, and offer a silent nod to the statue of Thoth still perched on your mantle at home, where you'll place the decree in a jar alongside your deed. As you trudge back through the village, the afternoon sun slants through date palms, painting golden stripes on the dusty path. You feel lighter, as if part of the burden has been lifted, though there's always another audit, another dispute lurking. But right now, with the gods firmly on your side, you dare to believe that barley will grow beneath your feet, and that Senhotep might finally keep his goats off your land. You duck under the threshold of your doorway, brush sand from your shoulders, and place the decree next to the wax-sealed deed. Tomorrow, or the day after, it's off to the fig tree again. But tonight you'll sleep without worrying about divine subpoenas. You settle under the fig tree once more, scrolls in hand, ready to perform your legal solo. After all, this is Egypt, a land with no lawyers, only litigants. You're your own advocate, your own opening statement, your own closing argument. It's equal parts exhilarating and exhausting, like being both chef and taste tester at a feast you didn't even cook. You unfurl your complaint and smooth out the wrinkles. The hot wind flutters the edges, sending little papyrus flakes dancing around your feet. You glance over at Senhotep, who's eyeing you like you're a particularly stubborn goat that won't get out of his garden. He smirks, clearly thinking that lack of a lawyer equals lack of a chance. But you've learned the unspoken script by heart. Here's the thing: ancient Egyptians had no professional legal advocates. Instead, they followed a standardized keen by speech form handed down through temple schools, memorized by scribes and citizens alike. You begin with the Kaith, the declaration of identity and social rank. I, Neferenpit, son of Didia, humble servant of Ammonius. Your voice drifts slightly, like oil on water, as you recite the formula. It's the same opening your grandfather might have used, the same that kings invoked, though hopefully without as many woolly insults about Senhotep's goatish impudence. You watch the judges lean in. They know this part. It's rote. The real dance happens next, the ideogrammatic plea. You transition smoothly. I stand barefoot on this sacred ground, feeling the dust of generations under my soles, to claim what is mine by birth and by right. You pause, letting the metaphor sink like a date in honey. That's one light joke down. Now for two more. Next, you move into the balancing section, where you contrast opposing testimonies. My neighbor insists the boundary was marked by a broken plow, though I suspect he borrowed it and never returned it, much like his sense of honor. A small chuckle ruffles through the crowd. The local bailiff shuffles his feet. The donkey behind you nearly yawns. The court scribe dutifully records every word. You're acutely aware that a slip here, an awkward metaphor or a smudged ink blot, could cost you more than just barley. It could cost you cosmic balance, inviting Ma'at's displeasure. Historians still argue whether this reliance on formulaic speeches ensured fairness or simply favored those with better memories and plumper notes of papyrus to practice on. You stride into the evidence recital phase. You describe the fish tax slip, the land registry scroll, the priest's solemn oath, all in the same gentle cadence your audience now expects for a relaxing bedtime tale. You speak of how Senhotep's witnesses spoke of boundary stones that glowed at sunset, which sounds poetic but is bonkers in practice. You suppress a grin, imagining a glowing rock spooking a goat at dusk. That's joke two. Then comes the petition for judgment. You look directly at the judges and say, "Therefore, I beseech this honorable Kenbet to restore my field to me, as surely as the Nile restores the land each year, and to bind the false claim of Senhotep like a reed bundle snapped in two." You fold the scroll with deliberate care, even as sweat beads behind your ears. This is your grand finale, your no lawyer needed flourish. Senhotep stands, shifting his weight. He reads his version. It's competent but lacks theatrical flair. He doesn't invoke the Nile or Ma'at or channel any godly winds in his voice. He simply states, field boundaries were amended when the harvest failed, then shrugs. You nearly giggle. Comparing theatrical flourishes to a shrug is like comparing a crocodile's raw power to a soggy breadstick. But you resist. That's joke 3. The judges confer. There's no gavel, no dramatic music. They murmur quietly, heads together like they're plotting a surprise feast menu. You scan the horizon, noting how the fig tree's leaves filter the sun into lazy patterns that look like hieroglyphs, an oddly soothing backdrop for your plea. In this system, representation isn't about hiring someone else, it's about mastering the art of ceremonial speech. You see local elders sometimes dispensing legal advice, usually over too much beer and with an eye toward future favors, informal counselors, if you will. Historians still argue whether these advisors were early, proto-lawyers, or simply gossipmongers. In any case, your best preparation was the 3 afternoons you spent copying court templates from a dusty scroll in the temple school. A judge taps a reed stick on the ground, signaling they're ready for a declaration. One by one, they gesture towards the scrolls. The scribe reads, the field matches the registry, the divine witnesses remain uncontradicted, and the speeches have honored Ma'at. The verdict, you spoke the sacred formula more faithfully than Senhotep did. The field is yours. You bow, feeling the wind pick up. The woven mats rustle like gentle applause. You tuck your scroll back into its clay jar, sealing it with thought. No wax today. You've earned a break from sealing. As you walk away, Senhotep catches up, extending a single date fruit. Congratulations, he says, voice surprisingly civil. Enjoy your harvest. You nod, accepting the fruit. It's tart. Perfect for drying into sweet candies. You pocket it like a trophy. Later, you sit by your field's edge, watching the evening sun stretch shadows across the soil. You realize that representing yourself wasn't just about knowing facts, it was about embodying the ritual, speaking with the cadence of the gods, and weaving memories into words. In a land without lawyers, that skill was your greatest asset. And as you run your fingers through the cool evening breeze and count the first fledgling stars, you nod to yourself. This is justice, ancient style, word by carefully crafted word, second person, under a fig tree, with no lawyer in sight. You return to the fig tree, scrolls tucked under your arm, ready for the day's centerpiece. Cross-examination of a donkey seller who claims your boundary stone once sat squarely in his corral. He's a wiry man named Packernut, known for exaggerating a good deal and always smelling faintly of cumin. Today, he's your most damning witness, or your greatest opportunity to shine. You settle onto your reed mat, the rough fibers pressing into your legs, and watch Packernut amble forward. He grips his staff like it's a scepter, eyes darting over the crowd. You can almost hear the donkey braying in the distance, his bray echoing like a cymbal crash in the lazy afternoon air. The judges give you the nod. It's your turn. Remember, cross-examination isn't about shouting. It's about guiding the witness so gently that their own words trap them. Think of it as herding a reluctant goat through a maze. You coax, you distract, you let the walls do the work. You begin with a gentle question in the standard Egyptian courtroom formula. Packernut, son of Pahiri, did you stand before the granary on the morning of the festival of Seshet? He nods vigorously as though he's rehearsed this moment. Mainstream records indeed confirm that cross-examination in ancient Egyptian courts often began with verifiable dates tied to festivals or temple calendars to anchor testimony in shared events. Good, you continue, voice soft like desert dusk. And did you observe the boundary stone marking Neferenpet's field that very morning? He clears his throat. Yes, he replies, squinting. It was there. You nod, then pause, letting the silence stretch until even the ibis birds stop fidgeting. Then, gentle trap, you ask, and would you say that stone was carved by the royal stonemasons, bearing the pharaoh's cartouche? He frowns. No, I don't think so. A small win. You lean forward as though sharing a secret. So, you're certain it was the smaller, local stone, rough-hewn, prone to chipping and shifting? His brow creases. Well, yes. You nod again. One judge scribbles. The other hums. You've planted a seed of doubt. If Packernut can't identify the stone properly, how reliable is his claim that it ever sat in his corral? Historians still argue whether cross-examination in this era prioritized substance over social status. Some suggest that any slip by a witness could overturn a case, while others believe that local prestige often swayed the judges regardless of inconsistencies. In practice, you suspect it was a bit of both. Next, you switch tactics, ramify his memory. Packernut, did you personally seed that corral with fodder on the eve of the festival? He shifts uncomfortably. No, my nephew did that. A ripple of surprise through onlookers. Many local disputes hinge on second-hand knowledge. You note it silently. And did you verify the stone before trading the donkey you sold me? You keep your tone even, as though discussing how the Nile brings silt, not how you might expose a lie. He glances at the donkey seller behind him, whose donkey is nearby, braying indignantly. I assumed, Packernut says, that what my nephew arranged was correct. You wait. The judges lean in. The donkey's bray punctuates the moment, oddly theatrical, like nature's own courtroom gavel. You've reduced his direct knowledge to assumption. That's the goal. For your quirky tidbit, you recall a fringe tale of a donkey that once testified in a Theban court? Okay, not really testified, but the donkey's bray supposedly coincided with the defendant's confession, interpreted as divine assent. Needless to say, it didn't become standard practice. You press on. Tell me, did your nephew carve the stone himself, or procure it from the quarry? He squints at the ground, clearly rattled. He said he found it near the canal. You nod thoughtfully. A stone found by a canal, prone to being moved by floods? He opens his mouth, then snaps it shut. He's caught. You move to the concluding blow. So in truth, Packernut, your claim rests on a stone neither you nor your nephew personally prepared, nor marked by royal hand, but shifted by water and memory. You let your words drift in the midday heat. He flushes. The judges confer again, murmuring about canal floods and stone erosion. You stand, satisfied that you haven't shouted or rushed. You've merely guided the witness into contradicting himself. Packernut's shoulders slump as he steps down. You retract smoothly, folding your arms in a natural gesture of composure. The judge's attention returns to you. That afternoon, you reflect on how, even without lawyers, cross-examination in ancient Egypt demanded psychological finesse, asking the right question at the right moment, anchored by shared calendrical events. And while historians still debate whether this style truly leveled the playing field or simply enriched those with sharper tongues, you know one thing. You walked that fine line without stumbling. As the sun dips low, you tuck your scroll away, heart lighter now that the donkey seller's testimony lies in tatters. You head home, letting the evening breeze carry away the tension. After all, tomorrow could bring final deliberations or another donkey ready to testify. You rise early the next morning, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of papyrus and baking bread from nearby vendors setting up for the day. Today's challenge is different. The ancient court's use of written contracts and how those scrolls shaped your lawsuit, even without the modern luxury of lawyers drafting them. You clutch a worn papyrus scroll, your contract with Packernut's nephew, a mix of ink and reed marks that stand between you and disaster. Written contracts in ancient Egypt weren't just formalities, they were living documents, carefully crafted to protect rights and prevent disputes. You're about to learn just how much weight these scrolls carried, especially when human memory faltered. You begin by recalling the basic fact. Ancient Egyptians pioneered detailed legal contracts, often sealed with personal marks or witnesses' signatures, sometimes just a fingerprint or a drawn symbol from those who couldn't write. These contracts laid out everything from land sales to labor agreements, yet historians still argue whether the average peasant fully understood all clauses, or if scribes subtly favored the elite. Today, you're on the side of common sense, hoping the scribes were fair. Your scroll says Packernut's nephew agreed to mark the stone boundary, and ensure it remains unmoved for 1 full year. But you remember Packernut's earlier admission. The stone was found near the canal, moved by water and possibly careless hands. The question is, can your scroll override shaky witness testimony? You unfurl the papyrus, the rough fibers whispering secrets. The black ink, faded but legible, contains standard clauses specifying what happens if either party fails their duties. These early contracts included what might pass for penalty clauses, gentle warnings of fines or labor if breached. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some contracts from this era were literally curse contracts. If you broke your agreement, you risked the gods' wrath, sometimes sealed by a formal invocation to Set or Anubis to punish the offender. You laugh quietly. Curses, it turns out, were a legal tool long before they became horror movie tropes. But whether these curses were taken seriously or just superstitious fluff remains a lively topic among scholars. As you examine your scroll, you realize the contract functions as a kind of substitute advocate. It's your voice in the courtroom, your written evidence, your formal demand. The scribes were the unsung legal architects, crafting documents designed to settle disputes quietly, without loud bickering. You remember that these contracts were often read aloud during court sessions. The judge or a scribe would declaim their contents, emphasizing every term so everyone knew what was at stake. This public reading carried a weight akin to modern courtroom procedures, reinforcing that law was a communal affair. Today, with your contract firmly in hand, you feel the subtle power of the written word in ancient Egypt. Unlike modern courts, where lawyers argue endlessly, here the scrolls sometimes did the arguing for you, quietly but firmly. Your thoughts drift to how much trust ancient Egyptians placed in these documents, sealed with their own marks, and how much faith they had that their words, once inked on papyrus, could endure floods, shifting stones, and even the test of stubborn donkey sellers. Tomorrow, you'll revisit the role of judges in this delicate dance of evidence, but for now, you savor the feeling that your scroll might just tip the scales. You arrive at the fig tree before sunrise, dew still clinging to your sandals, ready to present the most tangible piece of proof you've gathered, a broken pot shard bearing the faint imprint of Senhotep's thumb. This isn't hearsay or divine witness, it's hard evidence. In ancient Egypt, pottery fragments known as ostraca were often used as everyday writing surfaces, but occasionally they served as legal exhibits. Historians still argue whether ostraca were accepted as formal evidence or regarded as informal notes. Mainstream records show ostraca used for tax receipts and personal letters, but court usage remains debated. You hold the shard carefully, tracing the chipped edges. The pot once held your grain ration. The piece snapped off when Senhotep's ox backed into your storage jar. Witnesses remember you shouting and him shrugging. You've had that shard cleaned and displayed on a reed mat. No need to look like a forensics wizard, just a determined plaintiff. When court reconvenes, the judges murmur at the sight of the ostracon. You clear your throat and introduce it. Behold the fragment of my household pot, broken by Senhotep's ox on the eve of the harvest festival. Your voice is soft but firm, like the Nile's current after flood season. You place the shard on a small limestone slab. Common practice, since limestone was abundant and provided a neutral backdrop for examination. A scribe draws the shard into the trial record with charcoal, sketching its irregular lines. This mainstream practice of illustrating exhibits in trial logs helped ensure consistency across records. Next, you invite Packernut, the nephew, to confirm his uncle's ox caused the damage. His earlier testimony withered when pressed. Now you gently ask him to touch the shard and describe its texture. He hesitates, then runs his thumb along the imprint. Yes, he admits quietly, this matches the mark on my uncle's jar. You nod, allowing the moment to settle. A small crowd gathers, villagers, goats, even a stray ibis pecking at a fallen date. You can almost feel their collective gaze, expecting something decisive. To add a fringe twist, you recall a tale of an ostracon used centuries earlier, a shard inscribed with accusations that supposedly carried a curse, an early curse contract. Some fringe historians claim artifacts themselves could hold spiritual energy, swaying judges if displayed correctly. Whether that's true or just superstition, it's given you an idea. You subtly rotate the shard so the thumbprint catches the sun, casting a slight fingerprint-shaped shadow. Perhaps theatrics won't hurt. The judges lean forward. One taps his stylus against his reed mat. You quote the law. Any man who damages another's property must compensate in kind or by equal value. That's from the Instruction of Ani, a well-known legal text carved on tomb walls, mainstream evidence that property laws were codified by the new kingdom. Senhotep opens his mouth to protest, but you hold up a hand and speak again. This shard was collected within hours of the incident, witnessed by at least 3 villagers, recorded by the local scribe, and now validated in your presence. It speaks louder than any oath. You let that hang. The judges exchange glances. One scratches his beard, another taps his water jar stand. They consult the illustrated sketch in their log. Your ostrakhan sits there, charcoal lines neat and unmistakable. Historians still debate whether such physical evidence carried equal weight to sworn testimony or if it merely corroborated what witnesses said. In practice, you sense that a potent object like this shard can shift opinion more than a dozen dry statements. For your quirky tidbit, you mentioned that some litigants would rub a little soot into pot cracks to make damage look older or newer, adjusting the hue to suggest when the break occurred. You chuckle at the thought. False forensics in 1300 BC, and the judges crack faint smiles. Then comes the critical question from the head judge. How do you value this damage? In ancient courts, property damage was often quantified in grain or livestock. You propose a compensation of 2 jars of emmer wheat, plus a day's labor repairing your fence, an amount fair by local standards and proportional to the pot's worth. Senhotep grumbles but cannot refuse. The judges nod. They declare your shard not only valid but decisive. Senhotep must pay the compensation you requested. The broken pot, once a simple household vessel, has become the linchpin of your case. As you gather your shard and head home, you realize that in a land without lawyers, evidence wasn't just in documents. It was in the quiet authority of an object laid bare under a fig tree. Physical proof, like a broken pot, could speak volumes when words alone might falter. You tuck the shard into a cloth pouch, both trophy and reminder. Tomorrow, you'll draft the official compensation scroll. But tonight, you savor the certainty that tangible evidence, when presented with care, can tip the scales of justice almost as surely as any finely crafted speech. You arrive at the fig tree court feeling equal parts triumph and exhaustion, knowing that today you'll hear the verdict read aloud and experience the rituals that give finality to every ancient Egyptian trial. The morning sun slants through the leaves, casting lazy hieroglyphic shadows on the ground. You settle onto your mat, scrolls folded neatly at your side, and breathe in the familiar sense of dust, date palms, and distant incense from the temple. You've spent weeks gathering testimony, divine endorsements, and even a broken pot shard, and now it all comes down to this moment. A bailiff clacks 2 wooden blocks together, calling the court to order in a sound that echoes like a drumbeat through the sleepy crowd. The judges stretch, uncrinkle their robes, and ready themselves for the reading. In ancient Egypt, verdict readings were performed with almost theatrical slowness, every word weighed as carefully as grain on a scale. Mainstream records show that announcements could last as long as an entire hour, with pauses for ceremonial inhalations and the distribution of ritual water to symbolize cleansing of the dispute. The head judge unfurls the decree scroll, inked in black for narrative and red for emphasis, and begins. In the case of Neferenpit, son of Didia, versus Senhotep, son of Kai. You sit up straighter, heart ticking like a water clock, listening as the judge recites each clause. Boundary disputes, divine testimonies, measured cubits, and the validated ostrakhan. The speech is deliberate, almost sonorous, as if he's reciting a hymn rather than a legal ruling. You feel each syllable settle into the warm air. Between paragraphs, the judge pours water from a ceramic jug over his fingers, then flicks droplets onto the scroll, an act symbolizing the Nile's role in purifying truth. Historians still argue whether this ritual water was a genuine legal requirement or an elaborate tradition imported from temple ceremonies, but today it feels undeniably significant. You recall the evening oath to Mot, the divine confirmation in the temple. Now you witness the final echo of that sacred process. Halfway through, the judge pauses. A second judge steps forward, holds a bronze ram's horn trumpet, and blows a single, mournful note. It resonates through the fig tree's branches, startling a nearby goose into honks that somehow feel like applause. That's your quirky hit, the ancient Egyptian gavel strike, albeit with music, reminding everyone that justice here had a flair for the dramatic. The announcement continues. Senhotep is ordered to restore the original barley field markers, compensate you with 2 jars of emmer wheat, repair your fence, and present his goats at the next village feast as public apology. The judges conclude by invoking Ma'at and the pharaoh's name, your usual ceremonial sign-off, and end with a benediction for harmony in the community. You note how even a victory hinges on reconciliation, punishments balanced with reconciliatory acts, ensuring social order is restored, not shattered. As the final words trail off, the bailiff again clacks his wooden blocks, signaling the court's closure. A scribe comes forward, reads a summary in Middle Egyptian for those less fluent in the local dialect, and stamps the decree with a red lead seal, standard practice to authenticate rulings. You watch the seal pressed onto the scroll, leaving a fuzzy red bloom like a desert sunset on papyrus. Then comes the ritual you least expected, the sharing of beer and bread. The judges rise and gesture. Clay vessels of beer are passed around, bread loaves decorated with barley motifs handed out. You accept a cup, take a slow sip, and feel the gentle bitterness wash over you, an oddly fitting taste after weeks of stress. This communal sharing echoes temple festivals, reminding everyone that a verdict, win or lose, ends with unity, however fragile. You glance at Senhotep. He sulks at first, but when offered a cup, he takes it. His eyes flick to yours. You share a nod. No words, just the recognition that the law has spoken. Whether he truly accepts the outcome or plots another appeal, you can't know. But right now, as the village murmur softens into contented chatter and the scent of barley mingles with dust, you sense that Ma'at has been served. Historians still debate whether these post-verdict rituals reinforced genuine reconciliation or merely masked lingering grudges with piety and refreshments. Perhaps both. But as you stand, slap your mat free of dust, and toast your neighbors with a hearty, "To balance and barley," you feel the world right itself, if only temporarily. You tuck the sealed decree into your sash and step away from the fig tree. The leaves rustle overhead like an approving sigh. You're both plaintiff and judge of your own destiny in this land without lawyers. And as the sun climbs higher, warming the backs of even the most stubborn goats, you realize that justice here isn't just a decision. It's a performance, a ritual, and ultimately, a community feast. You arrive under the fig tree, the afternoon heat lingering like a half-remembered dream, to hear what happens when you lose a case. Except, of course, you already won. But today's lesson in ancient Egyptian justice is about fines, exile, and that most intangible currency, social shame. Think of it as the flip side of your victory, a cautionary tale whispered by cobras. Imagine someone else, call him Bekimhat, stood where you once stood, sweat dripping off his chin, awaiting judgment. His crime? Trespassing on his neighbor's onion patch and accidentally crushing a few bulbs. In a system without lawyers, judges still had teeth, fines paid in grain or livestock, forced exile to a dusty outpost, and the community's cold shoulder, which stung worse than a scorpion's pinch. Fines were straightforward: barley, emmer wheat, goats, geese, even jars of beer. Mainstream records from the Middle Kingdom show that property damage often led to compensation equal to 1.5 times the loss. An early damages multiplier, if you will. If your neighbor's goat ate 3 date palms, you paid for 4.5 palms in kind. Economically sound, but socially awkward when you had to hand over half a palm frond. No one likes fractional plants. For more serious offenses, assault, theft, or land encroachment, exile was on the table. Not ship you off to the middle of nowhere exile, but banishment from the village for a set period. Historians still argue whether these sentences were enforced strictly or often commuted by bribes. Some royal decrees note that chronic offenders escaped exile by offering jewelry or secret favors to local officials. Fringe accounts even mention exile parties, where friends ceremonially escorted one another to the border marker with celebratory feasts, playing music as if banishment was a grand pilgrimage. Then there was social shame, the invisible shackle. In a tight-knit village, your reputation was everything. If you lost a case, your neighbors would whisper about your foolishness under the fig tree. You might find your well water laced with sand, or your laundry strewn on the path. Some courts ordered the loser to stand in public at dawn for 3 days, wearing a sign painted with the crime, an ancient version of Walk of Shame, complete with ostrich feather duster for dramatic effect. You, of course, never faced exile or public humiliation, but you heard about Bekinhat's morning crook. He had to stand shirtless at sunrise by the temple steps, reciting, "I crushed onions and must pay," until someone tossed him a loaf. That little ritual embedded itself in collective memory as a warning. Win or lose, justice left its mark. Now, here's the twist for you. Even after winning, you were not immune to fines. Remember that audit by the month? The extra tax bracket you grudgingly accepted? That was a fine of sorts, what they called Shimu adjustments. The state could recalibrate your obligations regardless of courtroom outcomes. It was the law's way of reminding you who really held the reins. Quirky fringe evidence suggests that some investigators carried small seals shaped like scarab beetles. They'd stamp a loser's doorframe with a red impression, signaling unreliable litigant, an early bureaucratic scarlet letter. Whether these beetle seals actually existed or emerged as rumor in temple gossip remains debated among scholars. Neferenpit slipped through all that. You paid your 2 jars of emmer wheat to Senhotep, repaired your fence, and toasted with that communal beer. Yet you can't help but wonder, what if your case had slipped through the cracks? What if Pakernut's donkey had held up under cross-examination? Or if Thamon's audit had gone the other way? You shake off the thought, reminding yourself that ancient Egyptians believed social cohesion was as critical as any verdict. Justice wasn't only about punishment, it was designed to reintegrate offenders, sometimes by compelling them to host a feast for the accuser, ensuring grudges were forgotten over shared bread. Whether those feasts truly healed divisions or simply masked resentment under layers of stale flatbread is a point historians still debate. For you, the lesson is clear: losing costs more than barley. It costs honor, routine, and the quiet confidence of knowing you belong. And since you won, your social currency just rose, a benefit that no judge could quantify in cubits or scrolls. As the fig tree's leaves rustle above, you close your eyes and imagine Bekinhat's morning recital, the onion effluvia swirling around him, neighbors tossing loaves in mock sympathy. You suppress a smile. It could have been worse. Exile, ostrich feathers, or worse, imagine showing up to dinner with a thumbprint on your forehead. You rise, brush off your mat, and recall that even the righteous might face unforeseen fines. You pat your clay jar, seal deed and decree, knowing that for now, you've paid your dues, both literal and figurative. Tomorrow, you'll tend your field, and the only thing standing between you and chaos will be the sturdy fence you rebuilt with your own hands and the memory of how costly justice can be when you stumble. You wake to a dawn painted in soft rose and gold, ideal for sowing seeds, not plotting lawsuits. Yet here you are, remembering that in ancient Egypt, losing was one thing, but wanting more was another, the right to appeal. You've just barely settled the dust, repaired the fence, and tasted the communal beer when a hesitant messenger arrives carrying a folded scroll sealed with royal blue clay. The seal bears the emblem of the provincial governor's office. Appeals, you realize, are a climb up bureaucratic tiers, from village Kenbet to district council or even the governor's bench in the regional capital. You unfold the scroll. It's Senhotep's appeal. He claims procedural errors, improper oath-taking, mismeasured cubits, insufficient divine witness. He demands a rehearing under higher authority. You barely suppress a grin, imagining him pacing grand halls instead of under your fig tree. Appeals weren't common. Egyptian law prized finality. Yet some legal codes, like the Matem inscriptions at Deir el-Medina, explicitly mention the possibility of raising one's voice to the desert prince, a poetic reference to seeking justice from higher officials. Historians still argue whether these appeals were formal rights or privileges for the well-connected few. Some surviving papyri record only a handful of appeals per century. Others suggest scribes quietly rubber-stamped reconsiderations when bribes or divine omens demanded it. That afternoon, you travel with Senhotep, reluctantly, to the district capital, a dusty town of mud brick walls and half-finished temples. The provincial council convenes in a courtyard lined with date palms, their fronds casting lacy patterns on limestone benches. You find yourself seated on polished plaster alongside Senhotep and other petitioners, your stolen calm now tinged with apprehension. The head counselor, a stern woman named Nephremonius, presides. She wears a broad collar of faience beads and carries a stylus behind her ear, practical and symbolic. She gestures for Senhotep's petition first. He stands, voice trembling, raising the same points you've seen unravel under your careful cross-examination. My oath process was incomplete. The map scroll contained errors. Mot wasn't properly invoked. He unfurls the scroll dramatically, as though performing under a new spotlight. Nephremonius listens silently, tapping one bead against another. When he finishes, she doesn't immediately rule. Instead, she orders a review of procedural records from the original trial, official logs, oath transcripts, measurement reports, even notes on divine ceremonies. Scribes scuttle off, papyrus bundles in hand. It's a more formal process, far removed from the leisurely pace under the fig tree, and you sense the weight of real authority swirling in the air. Next, it's your turn. You rise, heart humming, scroll filled with notes clenched in your fist. You choose a different tactic, not to rehash old arguments, but to emphasize the integrity of your process. You begin with respect. Honorable counselors, I stand before you as Neferenpit, son of Didia, who accepted the verdict of the local Kenbet in good faith, trusting in Ma'at and the divine confirmation. Yet I also place my faith in the proper procedures of this land, which I hope you will verify today. That's your mainstream fact. Appeals hinged on procedural fidelity, judges deviating from precise rituals risked losing credibility. You continue by recounting how each step, from oath before Mot to divine stamps in the temple, was executed under official eyes. You mention the inspector's land survey cord, the archivist's registry scroll, even the ostracon's thumbprint validation. You're quieter than Senhotep but deliberate, like a date seed settling in fertile soil. For a fringe twist, you reference an obscure papyrus fragment rumored to describe an appeal presented on the back of a discarded calendar sheet. Historians still debate whether rowdy scribes ever repurposed mundane material for momentous petitions or if that's just a tall tale. The counselors exchange glances, perhaps amused at the idea of bureaucracy scribblers cutting corners centuries ago. You end with a measured nod. Thus, I place my trust in the records and the gods, confident that this process honors truth. You bow, the breeze ruffling your hair like a subtle applause. Counselors confer behind wooden screens. The scribe reads aloud from the original trial log. Every ritual noted, every measurement recorded, every oath sealed. They cross-reference Senhotep's objections and find them without merit. The oath was properly administered. The cubits match temple standards. The divine stamps bear sufficient imprint. They cite a clause from the instruction of Reckmeyer that warns against seeking undue reconsideration when no error is found. Nephremonius rises. Her voice is steady. The appeal of Senhotep, son of Kai, is hereby denied. The verdict of the local Kenbet stands. A soft murmur ripples through the courtyard. A lone ibis glides overhead, its wings casting a fleeting shadow. She adds a reconciliation gesture. Senhotep is advised to fulfill his obligations promptly, and Neferenpit is thanked for his patience in seeking higher review. Then, unexpectedly, she invites both of you to share a cup of wine from the royal reserve, an ancient olive oil amphora repurposed as a libation vessel. It's a nod to communal harmony, rare in appellate proceedings. You sip the tart wine, its sweetness a gentle reminder that even justice's long journey can end in shared drink rather than lingering resentment. Senhotep doesn't smile, but he doesn't scowl either. He sips rapidly, eyes flicking away. As you depart the capital and head home, you reflect on how appealing wasn't about raw facts alone, but about navigating layers of ceremony and record, an early form of legal hierarchy. Without lawyers, you learned that appeals meant mastering procedures, calling on procedural logs, and trusting that enough ritual and record could prevail. Back under your fig tree, the wind whistles through the leaves in a comforting rhythm. You settle onto your mat, the scrolls of victory and appeal now sealed in clay jars beneath the reed bench. Your field lies waiting, scrubbed of dispute, its soil ready for new barley. You may have faced the governor's court, but tonight, you rest content that justice, ancient style, has been preserved, not just by ink and papyrus, but by persistence, ceremony, and the quiet confidence to stand up for what's yours. You wake to the hush before dawn, the horizon a pale promise of light, and you realize this is your final act under the fig tree, your mortal saga reaching its close, even as a deeper story awaits in the duat, the realm of the afterlife. You gather your remaining scrolls and step into the soft gold of morning, knowing that in ancient Egypt, legal disputes didn't always end at the courthouse. The ultimate judgment awaited at the Hall of Two Truths, where your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. It's the final appeal, cosmic in scope, where even a victorious field claim might be overturned by a leaden conscience. You stand before the judges one last time, not human scribes now, but the memory of their reeds and robes lingering in your mind. You feel every measured cubit of earth beneath your sandals, every testimony recalled like a distant dream, and you understand that this world's justice prepared you for what came next. Mainstream texts, like Papyrus Ani, describe the weighing of the heart ceremony in vivid detail. Anubis guides your soul to a golden scale, your heart placed in one pan, the ostrich feather of truth in the other. If your heart proves heavier, Ammit the devourer awaits to consume your essence, and oblivion follows. Historians still argue whether Egyptians viewed this as literal or metaphorical, but to you it feels as tangible as the papyrus under your fingers. You remember how you invoked Ma'at's statue, sprinkled consecrated water, and offered barley grains. Those acts were more than ritual, they were rehearsals for this ultimate moment. Now you prepare your soul the same way you prepared your case, meticulously, with humility and a touch of theatrical flair. You picture yourself draped in white linen, the same garment you wore for court, stepping before Anubis. You'll recite your good deeds, returning boundary markers, compensating Senhotep, hosting the village feast, even offering figs to your rival. You'll confess the days you cursed under your breath, the nights you fumbled ink while drafting complaints. You'll ask the divine tribunal to weigh your heart fairly, to recognize the balance you strove to maintain in life. For a quirky tidbit, you recall fringe lore that some Egyptians inscribed miniature court summons on Ushabti figurines, hoping these servant statues would testify on their behalf in the afterlife. Historians still debate whether these Ushabti summons ever played a real role in funerary rites or were simply ephemeral hopes etched in clay. You smile at the thought of tiny figurines marching through Duat's corridors, scrolls tucked under stubby arms. As you walk the path home one last time, you pass the Temple of Osiris, its columns glowing in morning light. Worshippers carry alabaster jars of libations, and for a fleeting moment you wish you could slip into the procession, sashaying alongside them with your scrolls, deputized as an honorary priest. Instead, you slip a piece of linen from your sash into a shrine offering box, your silent plea for a compassionate verdict in the next world. Now, under the fig tree, you lay out the final decree scroll, sealed with red lead wax, beside your deed and the ostracon shard. You close your eyes and murmur a short prayer. May my heart weigh as lightly as a feather, may my deeds balance the scales, and may my soul find rest beneath the canopy of stars. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves above, as though Ma'at herself is nodding in approval. This is the end of your legal journey in life. What comes next belongs to the gods, to the mysterious halls where truth is more than speech and evidence, where your own heart speaks its final verdict. Word count, 1045. 300-word wind down. You drift away from the courtroom of life, the fig tree's leaves whispering lullabies above you, and you feel the warmth of the sun softening into a gentle glow. Your breath slows, matching the rhythm of the world as day folds into dusk. The dust beneath your feet settles, and the distant calls of marketplace vendors fade into the hush of twilight. You remember the measured cadence of the verdict reading, the slow pour of ritual water, the hush of Anubis's scales, each moment a quiet step toward balance. Rest now, knowing that you've honored Ma'at in word and deed. The barley fields will grow under your care tomorrow. Today, your spirit takes its ease. Let the creak of papyrus, the the rustle of scrolls, and the sigh of ancient stones lull you deeper into calm. Imagine the fig tree's shade extending into dreams, leaves brushing against your thoughts like gentle fingertips. Forgive the small errors, the crooked line, the smudged ink, the fleeting doubts. They too are part of your story and now fade into the soft tapestry of memory. Feel the feather of truth rise, lifting your worries as you float between worlds. The gods watch, impartial and serene, as you transition from litigant to dreamer. Close your eyes. Imagine the star-speckled sky of Duat, a realm where justice and peace entwine in silent accord. Allow the echoes of ritual trumpets and hushed prayers to lull you. Breathe in the calm, exhale the day's dust. Tonight, you rest beneath cosmic scales that hold both feather and heart in perfect balance. Good night, gentle traveler. May your dreams be as serene as a Nile at dawn.